The Grand Hall of the White House had never been this silent. Hundreds of journalists, dignitaries, and political leaders sat in rows, their eyes glued to the stage. The golden glow of the chandeliers reflected off the polished mahogany floor, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The room was filled with tension, curiosity, and an air of uncertainty. At the center of it all stood Barron Trump, the youngest son of President Donald Trump, tall, composed, yet visibly emotional. He was only 18 years old, but tonight he carried the weight of a nation's curiosity on his shoulders. For the past few weeks, rumors had swirled about Barron's upcoming speech. The White House had remained tight-lipped, and his father, the sitting president, had made no public comments about it. Some speculated it would be a heartfelt tribute to his father's presidency, while others suspected it would be something far more shocking. The cameras zoomed in on Barron as he took a deep breath, gripping the podium. His blue eyes scanned the audience, filled with familiar faces: his mother Melania Trump, seated at the front, expression unreadable, his half-siblings Ivanka, Donald Jr., Eric, and Tiffany, watching intently. The world was watching. And then he spoke. "My father is a man the world thinks it knows. But today I will tell you something you've never heard before." The hall fell into a deafening silence. The world stopped to listen. The silence in the hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every journalist, every politician, every American watching at home leaned in closer. Barron Trump, the son who had remained mostly out of the public eye for years, was about to reveal something the world had never heard. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "For as long as I can remember, my father has been a giant. Not just in business, not just in politics, but in my life. He is a man who commands rooms, who shapes conversations, who bends history with his will. But the man the world sees is not always the man I know." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, others simply sat frozen. Barron continued, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I grew up in a world where my father's name was everywhere. On buildings, on magazines, on the news. People either adored him or despised him, there was no in-between. But what they didn't see was the man who would sit with me late at night, after long days in the White House, and ask me how I was doing, the man who, despite everything the world threw at him, never stopped being my father." Melania Trump, seated in the front row, remained motionless. If she was moved by her son's words, she didn't show it. But there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of knowing. Barron inhaled sharply. "But I also want to tell you the truth. A truth I have kept inside for years. A truth I can't keep silent about anymore." The room tensed. Even President Trump, seated to the side of the stage, lifted his chin slightly, his eyes narrowing. "My father is not the man you think he is," Barron declared. Gasps echoed through the hall. The camera flashes exploded like fireworks. The president's advisors exchanged nervous glances. Barron looked out over the sea of faces. He is not just a leader, not just a businessman, not just a politician. He is something more, and something far more complicated. The anticipation in the air was unbearable. People were on the edge of their seats. What was he going to say? What revelation was coming next? Barron took a deep breath, preparing to reveal a truth that would change everything. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Millions of Americans watching from their homes sat frozen, their eyes glued to their television screens. Journalists, politicians, and even foreign leaders were waiting for what Barron Trump would say next. He tightened his grip on the podium, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't just revealing something about his father, he was exposing a side of the most powerful man in the world that no one had ever seen before. "My father is a man who never shows weakness. A man who believes that strength is everything. But I have seen something else. Something that I know he would never admit to." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. President Trump remained silent, his signature confident expression unshaken, but there was something in his eyes, something only those who knew him well could detect. Barron exhaled sharply. His voice was quieter now, almost trembling. There were nights when he sat alone in his office, long after the lights in the White House had gone dim. Nights when he thought no one was watching. But I was watching. Somewhere in the audience, a reporter whispered, "What is he talking about?" Barron's gaze locked onto the cameras. "I have seen my father break down." Gasps echoed through the hall. A journalist dropped his pen. Even seasoned politicians, people who had seen it all, looked stunned. Not in front of cameras. Not in front of his advisors. But when he thought no one was looking, I have seen him stare at his reflection, questioning everything. I have heard him whisper the words, "Did I do the right thing? Was I enough?" The room was deathly silent. The image of Donald Trump, the fearless, unshakable leader, was beginning to crack. Barron's voice grew steadier. "He would never tell you this himself, but I will. The weight of this presidency, the weight of being Donald Trump, is heavier than anyone could imagine. And no matter what you think of him, whether you love him or hate him, know this, he is human. The cameras zoomed in on President Trump. He remained still, his face unreadable. But something about him looked different. Barron swallowed hard. But there's more. And this is the part that will change everything. The tension in the room became unbearable. Reporters sat on the edges of their seats. Viewers at home clutched their remotes, unable to look away. Barron took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say next would shake the world to its core. There is something my father has kept hidden for years. And it's time you all knew the truth. The world stood still. The weight of Barron Trump's words hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Even the most seasoned journalists, the ones used to breaking news and political scandals, found themselves speechless. Donald Trump remained seated, unmoving. His fingers were laced together on his lap, his face unreadable. But behind those eyes, so well trained to conceal emotion, something flickered. Barron inhaled sharply, steadying himself. His next words would change the way history remembered his father forever. There's something my father has hidden for years. Something he never wanted the world to know. And I can no longer keep it a secret. A wave of murmurs rushed through the crowd. Reporters gripped their pens and keyboards, ready to capture history in real time. Barron closed his eyes for a brief second before speaking again. For decades, my father has built his image on strength. He told the world he was invincible, that nothing could break him. But the truth is, he swallowed hard. He has spent most of his life afraid. Another ripple of gasps. This was not the Donald Trump the world had come to know. Fear was not a word anyone had ever associated with him. He feared failure. He feared being forgotten. He feared that no matter how much power, how much wealth, how much influence he had, it would never be enough. Melania Trump, still sitting front and center, remained frozen. But even she could not hide the flicker of emotion that passed through her eyes. But there's more, Barron continued, his voice now carrying a quiet intensity. And this is the part that changes everything. The tension in the room was unbearable. There was a moment not long ago when my father considered walking away. From all of it. From the presidency. From the empire he built. From the world that had made him who he is. A journalist in the back accidentally dropped his notebook. The sound echoed in the silence. He didn't do it because he was weak, Barron clarified, shaking his head. He thought about leaving because, for the first time in his life, he realized that power isn't everything. The silence that followed was deafening. Barron's voice softened, carrying an almost tragic weight. He never told anyone. Not his advisors. Not his family. But I know. Because I saw it. Because I was the only one there the night he whispered to himself, maybe it's time to let go. A pin could have dropped in the room and it would have sounded like an explosion. The cameras zoomed in on Donald Trump. For the first time in decades, the world was seeing a side of him that no one had ever imagined. Barron looked out over the sea of faces before him. This is the truth about my father. Not the billionaire. Not the president. Not the media figure. But the man. A man who, despite everything, is still searching for something even he can't define. The weight of his words settled over the room. Some reporters had tears in their eyes. Others simply stared, unable to process what they had just heard. But Barron wasn't finished. And now, I need to tell you what he decided to do next. The final revelation was coming. The one that would either redefine Donald Trump's legacy or shake America to its very core. The entire world seemed frozen in time. Millions of Americans sat glued to their television screens, their hearts pounding in their chests. The reporters in the White House press hall had stopped taking notes, too stunned to react. And there, standing at the podium, Barron Trump prepared to deliver the final words that would shake history. After everything he has been through, after all the battles, the victories, the defeats, my father has made a decision. The weight in his voice sent a chill through the room. Donald Trump remained still, his expression unreadable. But those closest to him, his family, his advisors, were shifting in their seats, bracing for what was coming next. Barron took a deep breath, then spoke the words that would change the course of history. My father is stepping away from it all. A collective gasp erupted from the audience. Some journalists instinctively jumped to their feet. Even seasoned politicians hardened by decades in Washington looked utterly shocked. He is walking away. From politics. From business. From the world that has defined him for decades. For the first time that night, Donald Trump moved. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. But he said nothing. Barron continued, his voice steady despite the overwhelming weight of the moment. This is not a resignation. This is not a defeat. This is a choice. He glanced at his mother, Melania, who still sat motionless in the front row. then back at his father. For the first time in his life, my father is choosing something else. He is choosing peace. The word peace echoed in the room, a stark contrast to the larger-than-life persona Donald Trump had built over the years. He told me in a moment of rare honesty that he has spent his entire life fighting. Fighting for success. Fighting for power. Fighting against his critics. And now he wants something different. Barron swallowed hard, then delivered the final blow. This will be his last term in office. He will not seek re-election. He will not return to business. He will not run a media empire. He is stepping away for good. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted over each other, scrambling to confirm what they had just heard. News outlets rushed to break the biggest story of the decade. The world, love him or hate him, had never known a Donald Trump without power. And yet here was his own son, telling the world that the man who had built an empire on his name was ready to let it go. Barron looked one last time at his father. Their eyes met. For a moment, the entire world disappeared. And then, in an act no one expected, Donald Trump stood up and began clapping. One by one, the audience followed. Some clapped in disbelief. Others in admiration. But no one could deny it, history had just been made. Barron Trump had delivered a speech that would be remembered for generations. A speech that revealed the man behind the power. A speech that shook the entire world.